I've wanted to end this for a long time. The text came in at 6:12 inches the morning, lighting up my nightstand before the sun even came up. And for a second I just stared at it, thinking maybe I was still dreaming. But then another message followed. You deserve someone more. Aligned. And I actually laughed, a quiet, disbelieving sound in a silent apartment that still smelled like vanilla frosting from the cake sitting untouched in my fridge. And I typed back, okay, before I could think twice, before I could ask why today, of all days, before I could remind him it was my birthday. And when my phone buzzed again with his name, I didn't open it. I just blocked him, set the phone face down, and sat there with my hands folded in my lap, like I was waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock counting out a life I didn't recognize anymore. And later that morning, my friend Mia called, her voice already tight with concern. Elena, is it true? Jason posted something. Are you okay? And I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the box of candles I hadn't opened yet, and said, I'm fine. Even though the word felt thin in my mouth, like it didn't belong to me anymore, he just decided to leave. And there was a pause on the other end before she whispered, On your birthday? And I could almost see her shaking her head, picturing me the way everyone did, quiet, steady, the one who made things work, and I just shrugged even though she couldn't see it. It's just a day, I said. But my eyes kept drifting back to the cake, the one I picked up last night after work. The one I told the baker was for a small celebration, nothing big, and I remember her smiling, sliding the box across the counter. You should still celebrate, she said, and I nodded then, like I believed her, like I thought I'd be blowing out candles this morning with someone standing beside me, not reading a breakup text before I even brushed my teeth. And by noon my phone was filled with messages, some asking what happened, some pretending nothing had, and one from Jason's sister that just said, I guess this is for the best. And I stared at that one longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the screen before I locked it instead, because there was something about the way she said it, like this wasn't sudden, like everyone else had known something I didn't, and I moved through the rest of the day quietly, folding laundry, answering emails, taking a call I didn't mention to anyone, my voice calm, and even as I said, yes, I'll be there tomorrow morning. While my reflection in the window looked like someone else entirely, someone composed, someone unaffected, and that night I got dressed anyway, pulled on the black dress hanging in the back of my closet. The one Jason once said was, too simple for events that matter, and I stood in front of the mirror for a moment, smoothing the fabric over my hips, watching my own hands like they belonged to someone I was just meeting, and I whispered, you're fine. Out loud this time, just to hear it, just to see if it sounded more real, and when I walked out the door, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, I didn't look back, not at the couch where we used to sit, not at the photos still on the wall, because something about today had shifted in a way I couldn't name yet, something quiet but irreversible. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because I always wonder who's out there listening at moments like this. My name is Elena Cruz. I'm 31 years old, and this was the morning my fiancé left me on my birthday, the day everything in my life cracked open in a way I didn't understand yet. But to explain how I got here, standing alone in a dress I was never meant to wear alone, we have to go back to a few weeks before that message, back to the moment I first realized something about Jason and about my own life wasn't what I thought it was. Because the truth is, he didn't just wake up and decide to leave me that morning. He had been planning it, and I wasn't supposed to find out why. I grew up in a house where everything looked perfect from the outside, the kind of place with trimmed hedges, matching holiday decorations, and a dining table that was always set before anyone even got hungry. But inside, there were rules you learned without anyone saying them out loud, like how my older cousin Daniela always got the bigger slice of cake, or how my aunt would smile at her and say, "You deserve it. You have always been special," while I stood there holding my plate, pretending I did not notice the difference. And I remember one afternoon when I was about 10, standing in the kitchen while my mother washed dishes, the scent of lemon soap thick in the air, and I asked her quietly, "Did I do something wrong?" And she paused, just for a second, before saying, "No, Mija, you just have to be patient." Like patience was something you could grow into, like it would eventually earn you a place at the table, and I believed her, I really did. Because growing up, I learned to make myself smaller in ways that felt normal at the time. I learned to speak a little less, to step back a little sooner, to let other people take up the space I thought I had to earn, and it was not just at family gatherings, it followed me everywhere, even into my first jobs, where I would stay late to finish work that was not mine, or fix problems quietly so nobody had to notice me doing it. And I remember one of my first managers, a woman named Claire, watching me stay behind after everyone else had left. The office lights dimmed except for the one above my desk, and she leaned against the doorway and said, "Elena, why do you keep doing everyone else's work?" And I shrugged, eyes still on my screen. "It just needs to get done." And she let out a small laugh, not unkind, just tired. "It always does. But that does not mean it has to be you." And I nodded like I understood, but I did not change anything. Not really, because somewhere along the way, being the one who handled everything quietly had become part of who I was, and that is exactly the version of me Jason met 3 years ago. The version that smiled easily, listened more than she spoke, and never made anything complicated. And at first, he liked that. I could see it in the way he introduced me to people, one hand resting lightly on my back. "This is Elena. She keeps everything simple," he would say with a grin, and I would laugh along, even when something about that word did not sit right, because simple was safe, simple did not threaten anyone, and for a while, it worked. We fell into a rhythm that felt easy on the surface, dinners after work, weekends spent running errands or watching movies, conversations that stayed comfortably shallow, and whenever I tried to go deeper, to talk about the things I was building, the ideas I had been working on late at night, he would nod. But his attention would drift, his phone lighting up in his hand. And one night, about a month before my birthday, I remember sitting across from him at a restaurant, the kind with low lighting and overpriced cocktails, and I told him, "I might have to travel next month. There is a project I need to oversee." And he looked up, eyebrows raised. "Travel for what?" And I hesitated for half a second before answering, "Work." And he leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I thought your job was mostly remote, Elena. Do not tell me you are suddenly becoming ambitious." And there it was again, that word, said lightly but landing heavier than it should have, and I felt something tighten in my chest, but I just smiled, took a sip of my drink, and said, "It is nothing major," because it was easier than explaining something he had never asked to understand. And he nodded, satisfied, already moving on to something else, talking about his own plans, his next promotion, the people he needed to impress. And I sat there listening, the noise of the restaurant filling the space between us, realizing in a quiet, unsettling way that he had already decided who I was, and more importantly, who I was not. And I let him believe it, because at the time, it felt like keeping the peace. But looking back now, that was the moment something shifted, the first crack in a picture I had been trying to hold together, and I did not know it yet. But that small conversation, that one careless comment, was the beginning of a pattern that would lead to the morning he walked away, because what I thought was harmless misunderstanding was actually something else entirely, something deliberate, something that had already been unfolding behind my back long before I ever saw that message on my phone. I did not realize the shift at first because it did not happen in a dramatic moment. There was no announcement, no single event that forced me to stop and pay attention. It was quieter than that. It started with a call I almost did not take on a Thursday afternoon while I was still at my desk. The office mostly empty except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint clicking of keyboards in the distance. My phone lighting up with a number I did not recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail until something made me pick it up. "This is Elena," I said, keeping my voice steady, and the man on the other end did not waste time. "We have reviewed your proposal, and we would like you to come in," he said, his tone measured, professional, and I felt something inside me go completely still. "Come in for what exactly?" I asked. Even though I already knew, even though I had spent months preparing for this, nights and weekends building something that nobody around me had taken seriously, and he paused for half a second before answering, "To lead the project," and the words landed in a way I was not prepared for. Not loud, not overwhelming, just solid, like something real finally taking shape, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles above me. When? I asked quietly, and he replied, Monday morning, 9 o'clock, downtown office, and I said yes before he even finished the sentence, because this was not just another assignment. This was the kind of opportunity that changes everything if you are ready for it. And I had been ready for longer than anyone realized. And that night when I got home, Jason was already there, sitting on the couch with his laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting off his face, and he looked up briefly when I walked in. You are late, he said, not accusing, just stating it like a fact, and I set my bag down, kicking off my shoes. I had a call, I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral, and he glanced back at his screen. Work call? He asked, and I hesitated for a second before saying, yes, and he let out a small breath, almost a laugh. You have been having a lot of those lately. And I could not tell if it was a joke or not, so I just nodded, moving toward the kitchen. It is just temporary, I said, reaching for a glass of water, and he finally looked up again, this time studying me more closely. You are not taking on something you cannot handle, right? He asked, and there was something in his tone that felt less like concern and more like doubt, and I leaned against the counter, meeting his eyes. I can handle it, I said simply, and he held my gaze for a moment before shrugging. Okay, if you say so, and then he went back to his screen, conversation over. Just like that, and a week later I walked into that downtown office building, glass walls and polished floors, the kind of place where every step echoed slightly, reminding you exactly where you were, and the assistant at the front desk smiled as I approached. You must be Elena, she said, standing up to greet me, and I nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place I might look to someone who did not know me. They are expecting you, she added, leading me down a hallway lined with offices, each one filled with people who looked busy, important, and completely unaware of the fact that I had spent years preparing for this exact moment. And when I stepped into the conference room, there were 3 people already seated, all of them looking up at me with polite interest, and the man from the call stood up, extending his hand. We are glad you came, he said, and I shook his hand, steady, calm, like this was just another meeting, even though I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. And for the next hour, we talked through details, timelines, expectations, and at one point he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. You understand the scale of this, right? He asked, and I met his gaze without hesitation. I do, I said, and there was a moment of silence before he nodded, almost to himself. Good, he replied, and when I walked out of that building, the city felt different somehow, louder, sharper, like everything had shifted just slightly out of alignment with what it had been before. And that evening, I met Jason and his sister Daniela for dinner at her place, something she had insisted on, her voice cheerful on the phone earlier. We have not all sat down together in weeks, she said, and when I arrived, the table was already set, candles lit, Daniela moving around the kitchen with practiced ease, and she smiled when she saw me, but it did not quite reach her eyes. Elena, finally, she said, wiping her hands on a towel. We were starting to think you were too busy for us, and I laughed lightly, setting my bag down. Just work, I replied, and Jason pulled out a chair for me, his hand brushing my shoulder. She has been very busy lately, he said, and there was something in his voice that made Daniela glance at him quickly before looking back at me. Busy with what exactly? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, and I felt that familiar instinct to downplay, to keep things simple, and I opened my mouth to give a vague answer. But Jason spoke first. Just her usual stuff, he said with a small shrug. Nothing major. And the words hung in the air longer than they should have, and Daniela nodded slowly, like she was filing something away. Right, she said, turning back to the stove. But there was a tension there now, subtle but undeniable. And as we sat down to eat, conversation moving around me in easy circles, I found myself watching them both more closely than I ever had before, noticing the small looks they exchanged, the pauses that did not quite make sense, and for the first time, a quiet, unsettling thought crossed my mind, one I could not ignore no matter how much I wanted to, because it suddenly felt like I was the only one at that table who did not know what was really going on, and whatever it was already in motion, building towards something I was about to be pulled into whether I was ready or not. It started small, the kind of detail you almost dismiss because it does not make sense yet, like the way Daniela kept asking questions that sounded casual but felt too precise. "So this project of yours," she said halfway through dinner, slicing into her food without looking up. "Is it something stable, or just one of those temporary contracts?" And I glanced at Jason before answering, noticing how he avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his plate, and I forced a small smile. "It is long-term," I said, choosing my words carefully, but Daniela tilted her head slightly, like she already knew the answer, and was just waiting for me to say something different. "That is not what I heard," she replied, her tone light but sharp underneath, and something in my chest tightened. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady even as my mind started racing, and she shrugged, finally looking at me. "Jason mentioned you might be struggling a bit. That work has been inconsistent," and for a second the room felt quieter, like the air had shifted, and I turned to him slowly. "You said that?" I asked, keeping my voice low, and he looked up, surprised, almost defensive. "I did not say struggling," he said quickly. "I just said things have been unpredictable," and Daniela nodded as if that confirmed everything. "Right, unpredictable," she repeated, and I felt a strange mix of confusion and something colder, something sharper, because this was not just a misunderstanding. This was a version of me I did not recognize being spoken into existence, and I set my fork down carefully. "That is not accurate," I said, meeting his eyes directly now, and he held my gaze for a moment before looking away again. "Elena, I was just trying to explain," he muttered, and Daniela leaned back in her chair, watching both of us with quiet interest. "Explain what exactly?" she asked, and Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, you have been busy. You said it yourself. I just thought maybe you were overextending." And there it was again, that subtle shift, turning my work into something fragile, something unstable, something that needed to be explained away. And I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. "You could have asked me instead of assuming," I said, and for a moment he did not respond, just stared at me like I had said something unexpected, something inconvenient, and Daniela broke the silence with a soft laugh. "I think he is just worried," she said, but her eyes were still on me, measuring, calculating, and I realized then that this was not the first conversation like this. It was just the first one I had heard, and over the next few days, it became harder to ignore. Small comments slipping into conversations with friends, subtle shifts in tone when people spoke to me, like they were being careful, like they believed something about me that I had never said. And one afternoon, Mia sat across from me at a coffee shop, stirring her drink slowly before looking up. "Elena, can I ask you something?" she said, and I nodded, already knowing I would not like the question. "Are you okay financially?" she asked gently, and I froze for a second, the question landing heavier than it should have. "Why would you ask that?" I replied, keeping my expression neutral, and she hesitated before answering. "Jason mentioned you might be having some issues, that things are not as stable as they look." And I let out a quiet breath, leaning back in my chair, staring at her like I was trying to understand how far this had gone. "That is not true," I said simply, and she studied my face for a moment before nodding slowly. "I thought so," she said, but there was still doubt there, faint but present, and that was the moment it hit me. Not just what he had said, but how carefully it had been done. Not loud accusations, not obvious lies, just enough doubt planted in the right places, enough to reshape how people saw me without ever having to prove anything. And that night when I got home, I found Jason in the living room again, scrolling through his phone, and I stood there for a moment before speaking. "Why are you telling people I am struggling?" I asked, my voice calm but firm, and he looked up, clearly caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" he replied. But there was a hesitation there, just a fraction of a second, enough for me to notice. "Mia asked me if I was okay financially," I said, stepping closer. "Daniela thinks my work is unstable. Where is that coming from?" And he sat up straighter, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. "Elena, you are overreacting," he said, and I felt something inside me go very still. "I am asking you a simple question," I replied, and he shook his head, running a hand over his face. "I was just being honest," he said finally. "People ask, I answer. I cannot pretend everything is perfect if it is not." And the words landed like a quiet crack in something I had been holding together for too long. Everything is not perfect, I repeated, and he sighed, standing up now. You have been different lately. Distracted, secretive. You expect me not to notice. And I stared at him. Really stared this time. Seeing something I had missed before. Not concern, not confusion, but something more deliberate. Something calculated. And my voice dropped. Softer now. So you decided to control the narrative instead, I said. And he did not deny it. He just looked at me like I had finally caught up to something he had already accepted. And in that moment, everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because I realized this was not about misunderstanding anymore. It was about positioning, about preparing something, and the next words out of his mouth confirmed it in a way I was not ready for. I just do not think we are in the same place anymore, he said, his tone almost rehearsed. And I felt the ground beneath everything I thought I knew start to give way, because suddenly it was clear that whatever was coming next, whatever decision he had already made, I had never really been part of it at all. I did not argue with him that night, not because I did not have anything to say, but because something about the way he stood there, already distant, already decided, made it clear that this was not a conversation I could win, so I just nodded once and said, "Okay," the same word I would use weeks later without even realizing it, and he looked almost relieved, like he had expected more resistance, more emotion, something he could push against, but I gave him nothing. And for a few days after that, everything existed in this strange in-between. We still shared the same space, still moved around each other in quiet routines, but something fundamental had already broken. And then the messages started, not from him at first, but from other people, subtle, indirect, like ripples from something larger I could not see yet. And one evening my phone lit up with a text from Daniela. "We need to talk," it said, and I stared at it for a long moment before replying, "About what?" And her response came almost immediately. "About Jason. About you. About what is really going on." And there was something in the phrasing that made my stomach tighten, but I agreed to meet her anyway, because part of me still believed this could be fixed, that there had been some misunderstanding I could clear up if I just explained things the right way. And when we sat across from each other the next day, her posture straight, her expression composed, I tried to keep my voice calm. "I think there has been some confusion," I began, but she interrupted me with a small shake of her head. "Elena, you do not need to explain," she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "Jason has already told us everything." And I felt a sharp, quiet jolt in my chest. "Everything?" I repeated, and she nodded slowly. "That you have been hiding things, that your work situation is unstable, that you have been under a lot of pressure," and each word felt like it was being placed carefully, deliberately, building a version of me I did not recognize. And I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on the table. "That is not true," I said, steady but firm, and she watched me for a moment before sighing softly. "Elena, you do not have to keep pretending," she replied. And that was the moment I realized this was not a conversation. It was a conclusion, one that had already been reached without me, and I tried anyway. I tried to call Jason later that night, standing by the window as the city lights blurred together outside, my phone pressed to my ear as it rang and rang before going to voicemail. And I said his name once, quietly, "Jason, we need to talk," before hanging up, and then I sent a message, "There are things you do not understand. Please call me," and watched as it stayed delivered but unanswered. And the next morning I tried again, this time an email, longer, more detailed, explaining what I could, choosing my words carefully. "I think there has been a misunderstanding about my work and my situation," I wrote. "I have never been dishonest with you, but I have not shared everything, because you never asked." And I read it 3 times before sending it, sitting there with my laptop open, waiting for some kind of response that never came. And later that day, Mia called me, her voice hesitant. "Elena, I heard Jason is thinking about ending things," she said. And I closed my eyes briefly, leaning back in my chair. "He already has," I replied. And there was a pause before she asked, "What happened?" And I let out a slow breath. "I am still trying to figure that out," I said, because that was the truth, or at least part of it. And over the next few days, I reached out in every way I could think of. Messages, calls, even a handwritten note I left on the kitchen counter one morning before he woke up. Simple, direct, "We need to talk face to face." but each attempt disappeared into silence, unanswered, unacknowledged, like I was speaking into a void that had already decided not to listen. And what made it worse was not just his silence, but the way everyone else seemed to accept it. The way conversations shifted around me, the way people spoke to me more carefully, like they were handling something fragile, something already broken, and I found myself withdrawing without meaning to, canceling plans, ignoring messages, sitting alone in my apartment with the quiet pressing in on me from all sides. And one night, I stood in the kitchen again, staring at that same unopened box of candles, the cake long since gone stale, and I realized that despite everything I had done, every attempt I had made to reach him, to fix whatever had gone wrong, I was standing here completely alone, not just physically, but emotionally, like I had been slowly pushed out of my own life without even noticing it happening. And the worst part was not the silence itself, it was the realization that maybe I had never really been heard in the first place. I stopped checking my phone after the 4th day. Not because I stopped caring, but because the silence had started to feel heavier than any answer he could have given me. And there is a point where waiting turns into something else, something quieter, something that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. And I remember sitting on the floor of my living room that evening, back against the couch, the lights off, even though it was barely past 7, just watching the shadows stretch across the wall as the sun went down, and my phone buzzed once on the coffee table, lighting up the room for a second before going dark again, and I did not move. I just let it sit there, because part of me already knew it was not him, and when I finally reached for it, it was a message from my mother. "Mija, I heard something from Daniela. Are you okay?" And I stared at the words for a long moment before typing back, "I am fine," even though the word felt empty, like something I had been saying out of habit for years. And she called me a few minutes later, her voice soft, careful. "Elena, talk to me," she said, and I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the couch. "There is nothing to say," I replied quietly, and she was silent for a second before asking, "Did he leave?" And I nodded, even though she could not see me. "Yes," I said, and the word hung there between us, simple and final, and she let out a small breath. "Then you come home," she said gently. "Just for a few days, you should not be alone right now." And I thought about it, about going back to a place where everything had always been explained away with patience and silence, and I shook my head slowly. "I need to stay here," I said. And she did not argue. She just said, "Then promise me you will not shut everyone out." And I almost laughed at that, because I already had, without meaning to, without even noticing when it started. And after I hung up, the apartment felt even quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And the next morning I woke up before my alarm, the same way I had on my birthday. Only this time there was no message waiting, no sudden change, just the same stillness that had been there for days. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out when exactly everything had shifted, when I had gone from being part of a life to standing outside of it, watching it close without me. And later that day I forced myself to step outside, just to feel something different, the cool air against my skin, the noise of the street, anything that reminded me the world was still moving. And I walked without a destination, hands in my coat pockets, until I found myself standing in front of a storefront window, my reflection staring back at me, and for a second I did not recognize the person looking back. Not because she looked different, but because she felt distant, like someone I used to know, and I heard a voice behind me. "Elena?" And I turned to see Mia standing there, her expression soft but concerned, and she stepped closer. "I have been trying to reach you," she said, and I nodded. "I know," I replied, my voice quiet, and she studied my face for a moment before asking, "Have you heard from him?" And I shook my head. "No," I said simply, and she let out a small breath. "I do not like the way this is happening," she said. "It does not make sense." And I almost smiled at that, because she was right. It did not make sense. Not the way he left, not the things he said, not the way everyone else seemed to accept it without question. And I looked down at my hands, fingers curled slightly from the cold. "It does not have to make sense for it to be real," I said, and she reached out, placing her hand lightly on my arm. "You do not have to go through this alone," she said. And for a moment I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something in me hesitated, something that had learned over time that being alone was sometimes easier than trying to explain yourself to people who had already decided who you were. And I nodded anyway, because it was the only response I had left. And when I got back to my apartment that evening, I stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, the silence greeting me like something familiar now, something expected, and I moved through the space slowly, picking up small things I had ignored before, a glass left on the counter, a jacket draped over the chair, traces of a life that had been shared, and then quietly undone. And I realized then that this was the lowest point, not because of what I had lost, but because of how completely I had been erased from a narrative I did not even know was being rewritten, and I stood there in the middle of the room, letting that realization settle, not fighting it, not pushing it away, just acknowledging it for what it was. And for the first time in days, I felt something shift, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, just a small, quiet awareness that if everything had already been taken from me without my control, then maybe what came next did not have to follow the same pattern. And that thought, simple as it was, stayed with me longer than anything else had, because it felt like the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider before. The next morning, I did not check my phone at all. I left it face down on the kitchen counter while I stood there in silence, pouring coffee into a chipped mug I had owned since college, watching the steam rise slowly, like something steady and predictable. And for the first time in days, I did not feel the urge to reach for something that was no longer there. I just stood there and took a breath, then another, and when my phone finally buzzed again, I let it ring until it stopped, and then I picked it up, glanced at the screen, and set it back down without opening anything. Because whatever was waiting for me there no longer felt urgent, and that was new, that feeling of choosing not to engage, of deciding where my attention went. And later that morning I was already in the elevator of the downtown building, standing straight, shoulders back, my reflection in the mirrored walls steady and unfamiliar in a way that felt right. And when the doors opened, the assistant at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Elena. They are waiting for you." And I nodded, walking past her with measured steps, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward. And when I stepped into the conference room, the same 3 people were there, along with 2 others this time, papers spread across the table, screens glowing softly, and the man from before gestured toward the seat at the head of the table. "We would like you to walk us through your strategy," he said, and I placed my bag down, pulling out my tablet, my voice calm as I began. "We start by restructuring the timeline, not compressing it, but redefining how resources are allocated," and I watched their expressions shift slightly as I spoke, not dramatically, just enough to know they were listening, really listening, and when one of them interrupted, that would require a level of coordination we have not been able to achieve. I met his gaze without hesitation. "That is because you have been approaching it as separate units," I replied. "It is not separate, it is interconnected," and the room went quiet for a second before someone nodded slowly. And that moment, small as it was, felt different from anything I had experienced before, not because they agreed with me, but because they took me seriously without needing explanation, without needing me to prove that I belonged there. And after the meeting ended, the assistant caught up with me in the hallway. "That was impressive," she said quietly, and I smiled slightly. "Thank you," I replied, and she hesitated before adding, "We do not usually see that level of clarity this early on." And I nodded, because I knew exactly how long it had taken me to get here, even if nobody else did. And that afternoon I sat alone at a small table near the window of a cafe across the street, laptop open, reviewing documents, making notes, not rushing, just working through things step by step. And my phone buzzed again, this time a call from Jason, and I stared at the screen for a second before turning it face down again, letting it ring out, and when it stopped, a message came through. "Can we talk?" And I read it once, then locked the screen without replying, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been ignored before. And later that evening, Mia stopped by unannounced, standing in the doorway with a paper bag in her hand. "I brought dinner," she said, her voice softer than usual, and I stepped aside to let her in. "You did not have to," I replied, but she shook her head. "I wanted to," and we sat at the kitchen table, unpacking containers, the smell of warm food filling the space, and she watched me for a moment before asking, "You look different," and I paused, setting down my fork. "Different how?" I asked, And she shrugged slightly. Calmer, maybe, she said. And I thought about that for a second before nodding. Maybe I just stopped waiting, I replied. And she studied my face, searching for something. Does it not bother you that he is reaching out now? She asked, and I shook my head slowly. It does, I said honestly, but not the way it used to. And she leaned back in her chair, exhaling softly. I do not think he expected this, she said, and I almost smiled at that, because neither did I, not really. And as the days passed, I fell into a new rhythm, one that did not revolve around explaining myself or proving anything to anyone. I showed up where I needed to be. I spoke when it mattered. I stayed silent when it did not. And little by little, the space that had once felt empty started to feel intentional, like something I was shaping instead of something I had been left with. And one afternoon, as I walked out of another meeting, the same man from before stopped me in the hallway. We are expanding the scope of the project, he said, his tone direct, and we would like you to lead the next phase as well. And I met his eyes steady. All right, I replied, and he nodded once, like that was all he needed. And as I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the city stretching out in front of me, I realized that whatever had been taken from me had also cleared space for something else to take root, something stronger, something I had built quietly for years, without anyone noticing. And now, for the first time, it was starting to show, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to know that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than anything I had lost. The first time I saw my name on the glass door, I stopped walking without meaning to. Just stood there for a second, with my hand still on the handle, reading it again like I needed to make sure it was real. Elena Cruz, project lead, the letters clean and precise against the polished surface, and I let out a slow breath before pushing the door open, stepping inside with the same calm pace I had been practicing for weeks, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward like I belonged there. And the receptionist looked up immediately, her expression shifting into something more formal than it had been before. Good morning, Miss Cruz, she said, and I nodded once. Good morning, I replied, my voice steady, and as I walked past the open workstations, I could feel the subtle change in the room. Not attention exactly, but awareness, like people were adjusting how they saw me in real time. And when I reached the conference room, the team was already gathered, screens lit, documents spread out, conversations quieting as I stepped in, and one of the analysts stood up slightly. We were just reviewing the revised projections, he said, and I placed my folder on the table, glancing over the numbers. Show me where it breaks, I replied, and he pointed to a section on the screen, explaining quickly, and I listened without interrupting, then reached for the pen, making a small adjustment. It does not break, I said calmly. You are just reading it in isolation. Look at the upstream variables. And he paused, following my line of thought, and after a second he nodded. You are right, he said, almost to himself, and I stepped back slightly, letting him work through it, because I did not need to prove anything beyond that moment. And later that afternoon, the same man who had first called me into the project stopped by my office, knocking lightly on the doorframe. Do you have a minute? He asked, and I gestured toward the chair across from me. Of course, I replied, and he sat down, folding his hands together, studying me for a second before speaking. The board reviewed your latest proposal, he said, and they want to move forward with full implementation, and I nodded once, taking in the words without reacting too quickly. All right, I said, and he leaned back slightly, a faint smile appearing. Not many people get that kind of response on their first major project, he added, and I met his gaze evenly. I have been preparing for it longer than you think, I replied, and he held my eyes for a moment before nodding, like he understood something he had not seen before. And when he left, I sat there for a second, looking at the space around me, the clean desk, the organized files, the small nameplate near the edge that reflected the same title I had seen on the door, and I reached out, adjusting it slightly, not because it needed to be straight, but because I could, because it was mine. And that evening, as I stepped out of the building, the city air felt different, sharper, clearer, like everything was coming into focus in a way it never had before, and my phone buzzed in my hand again, the same name lighting up the screen. And this time I answered, not because I felt the need to, but because I wanted to see what he would say. Elena. Jason's voice came through, quieter than I remembered, almost careful. "I have been trying to reach you," and I stood there on the sidewalk, watching people move past me, their footsteps steady against the pavement. "I know," I replied, my tone even, and there was a pause before he continued. "I think we need to talk," and I let a small silence stretch between us before answering. "We already did," I said, and he exhaled softly. "That is not what I meant," he said, and I could hear something unfamiliar in his voice now, not confidence, not certainty, something closer to hesitation, and I leaned slightly against the building, my fingers resting loosely around the phone. "Then what do you mean?" I asked, and he hesitated again, longer this time, before saying, "There are things I did not understand," and I looked out at the street, the reflection of the city lights beginning to form in the windows around me, and for a moment I said nothing, because I was thinking about everything that had changed since the last time we spoke, everything he had chosen not to see, not to ask about, not to understand when it mattered, and I finally replied, "You are right," I said quietly. "There are." And the conversation ended shortly after that, not with resolution, not with closure, just with a shift I could feel, but not fully define yet, and as I walked away, heels steady against the pavement, I realized that this moment, standing here with everything in front of me instead of behind me, was not the end of anything. It was the point where everything connected back to that morning, that message, that silence, and I knew that whatever came next would not be about what I had lost, but about what I had chosen to build in its place. I agreed to meet him 3 days later, not at our apartment, not anywhere that carried the weight of what used to be ours, but at a quiet hotel lounge downtown, the kind of place where conversations stayed low and no one looked twice at you if you sat alone for too long. And I arrived early, not out of nerves but out of habit, choosing a table near the window where I could see the entrance without being seen immediately. And I sat there with my hands folded loosely in front of me, a glass of water untouched, watching the reflections of people moving through the lobby, their footsteps soft against the polished floor, everything calm on the surface, but underneath it there was something tighter, something waiting. And when my phone buzzed, I glanced down to see his message. "I am here." And I looked up just as he stepped inside, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. And for a second he stopped walking, like he needed to adjust to what he was seeing, like I did not match whatever version of me he had been holding on to. And then he moved again, slower this time, more careful, and when he reached the table, he hesitated before pulling out the chair across from me. "Hi," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered, and I nodded once. "Hi," I replied, my tone even, and he sat down, placing his phone on the table like he needed something solid in front of him, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, and then he cleared his throat. "You look different," he said, and I almost smiled at that, because I had heard that before, just not from him. "Different how?" I asked, and he shifted slightly in his seat, searching for the right word. "More confident," he said finally, and I held his gaze for a second before replying, "I have always been capable," and something in his expression changed at that, like he was realizing how much he had missed, how much he had chosen not to see, and he nodded slowly. "I know that now," he said, and I let the words settle between us without responding, because knowing something now did not change the fact that he had not known it when it mattered, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "There are things I need to explain," he continued, and I tilted my head just a fraction. "Explain," I repeated, and he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized, but that felt different now, less controlled, more uncertain. "I did not handle things the right way," he said. "I should not have told people what I did," and I watched him carefully, noting the way his words came out measured, like he had rehearsed them. "Why did you?" I asked, not raising my voice, not pushing, just asking, and he hesitated, his eyes dropping to the table for a moment, before lifting back to mine. "Because I thought I understood the situation," he said, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the glass. "You thought I was struggling," I said, and he nodded. "Yes," and there was something almost defensive in the way he said it, like he still believed part of it, and I let out a quiet breath. "And instead of asking me, you told everyone else," I said, and he shifted again, uncomfortable now. "I was trying to make sense of things," he replied, and I held his gaze. "Steady, unchanging." "For who?" I asked, and that question seemed to catch him off guard, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, because there was no easy answer to that, no explanation that would not reveal exactly what he had done, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, not empty, but filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had been assumed, and after a moment he leaned forward again, his voice softer now. "I did not realize how much I was getting wrong," he said, and I watched him for a second, before asking, "What changed?" And he exhaled slowly, like he had been holding that answer back, like it mattered more than anything else he had said so far, and when he finally spoke, his voice dropped just enough to make it feel more real. "I found out about your work," he said, and something in the way he said it, careful, deliberate, made the air between us tighten slightly, and I did not respond immediately. I just looked at him, waiting, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, the point where the version of me he had created no longer held, and he swallowed, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table. "I did not know," he added, almost quietly, and I tilted my head just a fraction, my voice calm, controlled. "What exactly did you not know?" I asked, and he looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing something for the first time, something he had overlooked completely, and for a second he did not answer. The words caught somewhere between realization and regret, and that was where everything paused, right on the edge of something that could not be taken back once it was said. He did not answer right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because it was not confusion, it was calculation, like he was trying to decide how much of the truth he could admit without fully exposing himself. And I watched him carefully, the way his fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, the way his eyes flickered for a second before settling back on mine, and then he finally spoke, slower this time, more deliberate. "I did not know you were leading that project," he said, and I let a small pause stretch between us before replying, "Which project?" And he exhaled softly, like he had expected that question. "The one downtown, the one everyone has been talking about," he said, and there it was, not the full truth, just the edge of it, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my voice calm, almost neutral. "That is part of it," I said, and he frowned, just a little, like something was not lining up the way he thought it would. "Part of it?" he repeated, and I nodded once. "Yes," I said, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the noise of the lounge fading into the background as the space between us sharpened, and then I reached into my bag, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple movement, and placed a thin folder on the table between us, sliding it slightly in his direction, and he looked down at it before looking back up at me, confusion clear in his expression. "What is this?" he asked, and I held his gaze steady. "Information you should have asked for before you made assumptions," I replied, and he hesitated for a second before opening it, his movements slower now, more cautious, and I watched as his eyes moved across the first page, then the next, his expression shifting in small, almost imperceptible ways, confusion giving way to something sharper, something closer to realization, and he looked up at me again, this time with a different kind of focus. "This says you are not just leading the project," he said, his voice lower now. "It says you designed the entire framework," and I nodded slightly. "Yes," I replied, and he blinked, like he was trying to process that, like it did not fit the version of me he had been holding on to. "And this," he continued, flipping another page, "this is not just one contract." And I could see it happening now, the moment where everything he thought he knew was being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, and I leaned forward just enough to meet his gaze more directly. "No, it is not," I said, and he swallowed, his hand still resting on the edge of the folder. "You have been building this for how long?" he asked, and I did not hesitate. "Years," I replied. And the word settled heavily between us, because it meant something he could not ignore. It meant that everything he had said, everything he had told other people, had been based on a version of reality that never existed. And he leaned back slowly, his hand moving away from the folder, as if it had become something unfamiliar. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and I held his gaze. Calm, controlled. "You never asked," I said. And the simplicity of that answer seemed to hit harder than anything else I could have said, because it was true in a way that left no room for argument. And for a moment he just stared at me, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different. heavier, more final, and then he shook his head slightly, almost to himself. "I thought," he started, but stopped, because whatever he thought no longer mattered, and I watched him carefully, noting the shift in his posture, the way his confidence had been replaced with something quieter, something uncertain. And I spoke again, my voice steady. "You thought I was comfortable," I said, "that I was not ambitious, that I was just there." And he did not deny it. He just looked down for a second before nodding. "Yes," he admitted, and I leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. "And you told people that?" I continued, not accusing, just stating it, and he exhaled slowly. "I did," he said, and there was something almost fragile in the way he said it now, like he was realizing the weight of it for the first time, and I nodded once. "That is what they believed," I said, and he looked up at me again, his expression shifting into something closer to regret. "I did not know," he repeated, quieter now, and I held his gaze, my voice calm but firm. "That is the problem," I said. "You did not know, and you did not try to know. You decided instead." And the words landed between us with a quiet finality. And for a moment he said nothing, just sat there, the reality of what he had done settling in, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through the absence of anything left to argue, and I could see it in his face now, the realization not just of who I was, but of what he had lost without ever understanding it. And that was the moment everything changed, not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded anything from him, but because the truth had been placed in front of him in a way he could not ignore. And he sat there, completely still, as if the ground beneath his understanding had shifted without warning. And for the first time since he walked into that room, he had no control over what came next. He did not reach for the folder again after that. He just sat there with his hands resting flat against the table, like he needed something steady to hold on to. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the silence no longer uncomfortable but final, in a way that did not leave space for anything else. And then he let out a slow breath, looking past me for a moment before his eyes came back, sharper now, more aware. "They do not know any of this," he said quietly, and I understood immediately who he meant, without him having to say it, and I nodded once. "No," I replied, my voice even, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if the conversation could still be contained. "You need to tell them," he said, and I held his gaze for a second before answering. "Why?" And that single word seemed to catch him off guard, his mouth opening slightly before he found his footing again. "Because they are making decisions based on what they think is true," he said. And I tilted my head just a fraction, my expression calm. "They are making decisions based on what you told them," I replied, and he flinched just slightly, like the distinction mattered more than he wanted it to, and he ran a hand through his hair again, the movement less controlled now. "I can fix that," he said quickly. "I can explain. I can tell them I was wrong." And I watched him for a moment, not reacting immediately, letting the words settle, and then I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, and the simplicity of it seemed to hit harder than anything else, because he froze for a second, clearly not expecting that answer. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, his voice tightening slightly, and I leaned back in my chair, my posture relaxed but firm. "I mean, you do not get to rewrite this now that you understand it," I said. And he stared at me, confusion shifting into something closer to frustration. "Elena, this affects you too," he insisted. "People think," and I cut him off gently, not raising my voice, just speaking over him with quiet certainty. "People think what you showed them," I said, "and I am not interested in correcting it for them." And he blinked, trying to process that. "Why not?" he asked. And I met his eyes steady. "Because it is not my responsibility to manage their perception," I replied. And there was a pause, longer this time, the kind that forces you to sit with what has been said instead of moving past it. And he leaned back slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if something inside him had shifted. "They are going to ask questions," he said, and I nodded once. "They can," I replied, and he shook his head almost to himself. "You are really just going to let them believe that?" he asked, and I let out a quiet breath, my voice calm but clear. "I am going to let them believe whatever they choose to believe," I said, "the same way you did," and that landed differently. I could see it in the way his expression changed, the realization settling in without resistance this time, and for a moment he said nothing, just looked at me like he was seeing the full shape of what had happened, not just the facts but the consequences. And then he spoke again, softer now. "I did not think it would go this far," he admitted, and I nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. "You did not think at all," I replied, and there was no anger in my voice, just clarity. And he looked down at the table for a second before exhaling slowly. "Daniela is going to find out," he said, almost like a warning, and I tilted my head slightly. "Eventually," I replied, and he looked back up, studying me carefully. "She is not going to react well," he added, and I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it felt predictable. "That is not something I need to manage," I said, and he leaned forward again, his voice lower now, more urgent. "You do not understand. She already thinks," and I interrupted him again, gently but firmly. "I understand exactly what she thinks," I said, and that stopped him completely, because there was nothing left to explain that I had not already seen, already experienced, and the weight of that realization settled between us, quiet but undeniable. And after a moment he leaned back again, his posture less certain now. "I did not expect you to handle this like this," he said, and I held his gaze, my expression unchanged. "That is because you never really knew me," I replied, and the words were not sharp, not defensive, just true. And he let out a small breath, almost a laugh but without any humor in it. "I see that now," he said, and I nodded once, because that was the only part that mattered, not what he said next, not how he tried to adjust, but the fact that the version of me he had believed in no longer existed in front of him. And as the conversation slowed, the energy shifting into something quieter, something unresolved, I realized that this was not the end of anything. Not yet, because the truth had been revealed, but the consequences were still unfolding, and there were still people who had not heard it, who were still holding on to the version he had given them, and I could feel it lingering, just beneath the surface, waiting to rise in ways I had not fully seen yet. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly what made it feel different, because for the first time in a long time, my life was not shaped by someone else's decisions, it was shaped by my own. Quiet choices that added up over time, like the way I woke up in the morning without checking my phone, or how I walked into my office, saw my name on the door, and did not question whether I belonged there. I just stepped inside and started my day, and there were still moments when things felt unfinished, when conversations lingered in the back of my mind, when I would catch myself thinking about how easily everything had been rewritten without me, but those moments did not control me anymore. They passed, like everything else, and one afternoon, as I stood by the window in my office, watching the city move below me, I realized that what I had lost was not as important as what I had gained, not in the obvious sense of success or recognition, but in something quieter, something more permanent, the ability to trust myself without needing someone else to confirm it. And that realization stayed with me, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a steady presence, like something I had finally returned to after being away for too long. And I think that is the part people do not talk about enough, how easy it is to let someone else define you without even noticing it, how you can slowly adjust yourself to fit into someone else's expectations until you forget what you were capable of on your own. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is that your silence should never be mistaken for a lack of strength, and your patience should never be used as permission for someone else to rewrite your worth, because the moment you start believing a version of yourself that was built on someone else's assumptions, you lose something far more important than any relationship. You lose clarity, and without clarity, it becomes very easy for someone else to step in and decide who you are, for you. And if you are listening to this, and something in this story feels familiar, if you have ever been in a place where you felt misunderstood, underestimated, or quietly pushed into a smaller version of yourself, I want you to know that you are not alone in that, and more importantly, you are not stuck there, because the same awareness that allows you to see what is happening can also guide you out of it. Your intuition is not something you should ignore. It is something you should learn to trust, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it means facing truths you would rather avoid. And protecting yourself is not just about setting boundaries with other people, it is also about being honest with yourself, about what you are willing to accept and what you are not, emotionally, financially, mentally, because once you lose that clarity, it becomes very difficult to rebuild it, but not impossible, never impossible. And sometimes, whether you believe in God, in the universe, or simply in the quiet logic of life. There is a way things shift when you finally choose yourself, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in small, steady moments that bring you back to who you were before you started questioning your own value. And I did not walk away from that meeting with anger or even closure. I walked away with something much more useful, understanding. And with that understanding came freedom, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's approval or recognition. And as I stood there later that evening, back in my apartment, the same place that had once felt empty, I opened the drawer in my kitchen and found the box of candles I had not used on my birthday, still unopened, and for a second I just held it in my hand. Remembering that morning, that message, that moment, everything changed. And then I took one candle out, placed it on the counter, and lit it, watching the flame steady itself after a brief flicker, small but consistent. And I realized that growth does not always look like something new. Sometimes it looks like returning to yourself with a deeper understanding of who you are and what you deserve. And if I could leave you with one thing, it would be this: do not wait for someone else to recognize your value before you allow yourself to live fully in it, because by the time they do, you may already have outgrown the version of yourself they were comfortable with. My name is Elena. I am 31 years old. And the lesson I want to leave you with is this: never let someone else's limited understanding of you become the limit you place on yourself. Thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to be shared, because sometimes the simple act of being heard is what reminds us that we are not as alone as we think. And if this story stayed with you in some way, feel free to share where you are listening from, or pass it along to someone who might need it. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, there are others waiting for you, different lives, different moments, but all connected by something real, something human. And maybe the next story you hear will meet you exactly where you are right now.